Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, eminent researchers, heads of research, agricultural development agencies and institutions. I was going to say good morning, but it's already afternoon. It's been a pleasure for me to accept this task of providing what is called a keynote speech. I don't know if it's going to be low note or keynote, but it's interesting because basically what I've been asked to do was an inventory on Africa's agriculture today. But as you would see in the title that I changed a bit, I preferred to put it in a forward-looking manner instead of a clear passive inventory. And as an introduction, I would say that following Kwado Asenso's 27-question agricultural development agenda, Schengen fans 5 areas for doing agricultural development business unusual, and Monty's masterpiece of talk about science, technology, and innovation for agricultural transformation, I would say that there is very little left to say. But as some people say, repetition has its clear pedagogic value. So although I'll try to avoid as much as possible repeating exactly what they said, I'll certainly be forced to come back to some of those issues. In terms of doing business unusual, I had the opportunity 6 years ago to be a keynote speaker at the 3rd General Assembly of FARA in Entebbe. And there, I proposed that we could do business unusual, since the title of my presentation there was Innovations to Transform Agriculture for Improved Livelihoods and Development in Africa. I propose that we need to innovate in 3 different areas: in our conceptual and analytical framework for agricultural development, in the geographical or spatial focus or scope, and also in the operational approach to that. And 3 years ago, I had a chance also to discuss issues of agricultural development in Africa during a meeting of the UN Commission on Sustainable Development in New York that was in the midst of the 2007-2008 food crisis, global food crisis, where I introduced my speech by saying that the global food crisis could have been a blessing for Africa instead of the trauma that the continent lived. For a simple reason, and it was said this morning, this continent has all it takes not to be food self-sufficient, but to be a major player in the global food market, even today. Without any kind of a breakthrough, even in technologies, it can double yields in almost all commodities, and it has also room to maneuver in terms of area. This being said, I used to use a little arithmetic, let's say, model by saying that if you were to simply double yields of major crops without adding a single hectare, you double food production in this continent and turn the continent into a major net food exporter today, and it's feasible. If you add to that a 50% increase in area, you triple the production of the continent, and it's feasible. This being said, let's move to the next slide here. What I'm going to do is briefly say why it's so important to think in terms of structural transformation of agriculture in Africa, What are some of the challenges and opportunities for doing so? And what we are proposing as a regional approach to that. First of all, we all know that agriculture continues to be a key sector in the economies of most African countries. Still, 52% of active labor is in agriculture. And the data can change. Some people say 13% of GDP is provided when you include South Africa and some other countries. But I tend to think that it's still above 20% of GDP contribution from agriculture, from particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And the proportion of labor in agriculture has been declining. We all know that. We used to cite figures of 70% of labor, then 60%, and now we're talking about 50%. But is this an indicator of real structural transformation? This is a question for all of us to ponder. You see, we are still about 500 million people in agriculture. Next, please. Agriculture is the backbone of economies, not only in terms of labor force, in terms of providing employment for the rural people, but also in terms of the proportion of non-farm, rural, as well as urban employment linked to agriculture. We all know about this issue of intersectoral growth and employment multipliers. They're quite high in Africa for agriculture. Another linkage between the rural or the agriculture sector and the urban sector is through the proportion of budget of urban households that goes to food, 50 to 60%. But all this is becoming really complicated when we realize that today Africa is importing between 30 and $50 billion of food and agricultural commodities per year, added to which you have to take into account about $3 billion of food aid, and in spite of all this, about 1/4 of the population of the total population of the continent goes hungry. A serious challenge. One challenge that we think that agriculture should face in our research, in policy discourse, and so on and so forth, has to do with the future. How is the African food and agricultural market shaping up to the future? We have indications from, I think, NEPAD figures that current demand, aggregate demand, urban demand for food in Africa is about $50 billion. That will triple by 2030. So there is a market there. How to get African farmers to capture that market is the key problem. And we know that in spite of that growing market, Africa has been importing increasingly. Increasingly, as you would see that cereal imports over the 10 years from 1998 to 2008 increased by 42% in volume, but look at the figure in value, 160%. So this continent is paying increasing amounts of monies to feed agricultures outside of the continent. Let's think of it that way. Intra-regional trade is very low compared to those figures. I mentioned about $30 to $50 billion imports from outside of Africa against about $4 billion trade, intra-regional trade in agriculture. Next slide. You see the trend in the value of global food and agricultural imports in the continent. going from about 10 billion back in the 1980s to something like $50 billion now. Next, please. Another challenge is for African agriculture to be aggressive and start capturing part of the global market. Africa's share on that market has fallen from 15% by the mid-1960s to less than 4% now. So loss of competitiveness in the domestic regional market and loss of competitiveness in the global market. A disconnect from both of those markets. Where are the critical challenges? The main challenge we use to call it here is one of undercapitalization, low productivity and competitiveness resulting from decades of neglect of agriculture. And that can be seen in figures about irrigation that were mentioned this morning. Right now, sub-Saharan Africa has barely 3.5% of agricultural land being irrigated. That is only 18% of the potential for irrigation in sub-Saharan Africa. The same goes for fertilizer use. We had the Abuja Food Fertilizer Summit, and where the target of reaching 50 kilos of fertilizer on average per hectare was put against a current level of about 8 to 10 kilos. The same thing applies, paucity or undercapitalization and underinvestment applies to infrastructure, whether we talk about road, energy, communications, etc. Same thing applying to your institutions. Basically, the agricultural education, research, and extension institutions, which have been also forgotten for quite a few decades. As a result, labor productivity is not high. We are told that it has increased by about 22% over the last 10 years, but it's still very much below levels in other regions of the world. Land productivity, which is critical here, is also low. It's very low compared to, not only compared to other regions, developing regions of the world, but compared to the potential that research has shown, demonstrated that it could reach. And we have a few graphs just to illustrate that. You see how flat is the average cereal yields over the almost 30-year period, going from around 1 ton to maybe 1.5 tons over more than 30 years. Next one. And when we look at the maize yields, this one is interesting because you see, as it was mentioned, over the last few years, there have been, probably since the global food crisis, some yield gains in places, particularly when you look at Malawi there. Maize yields have more than doubled. It means that there was some level of response to the government support. Whether this is sustainable or not is another issue to discuss, but those subsidies and support to farmers did pay. But when we look at the level of the yields, it means that even in Africa, if things are done correctly, you can have a green revolution very quickly. Look at what is happening in Mauritius, for example. This is a resource-poor country and so on and so forth, but in spite of that, if you look at the mix of what I call the TIIPs, technology, institutions, infrastructure, and policies that they put behind maize production, you see that the yields there are well below, above 8 tons. So some improvement, but a big margin for improvement. Same thing for rice. And rice, when you compare all African countries to the level of yields in Vietnam and Thailand, Okay, a good deal of African countries compare favorably to Thailand, but are still far below levels in Vietnam. And we know that there is a big potential because Africa Rice has been telling us that over the last 3 years, since 2008, there have been tremendous increase in rice production. Particularly in West Africa, I've seen figures of increase by 27, almost 27% in 2008, 5% in 2009, 10% in 2010, giving an average growth rate of about 9% per year, at which rate you could double rice production in 7 years. And it can be done even faster than that if conditions are right there. Next. Okay, I'll jump on that. This is the general figure about cereals production. So there are two critical areas when we look within a regional perspective where we think that challenges should be looked at very critically. The first one is addressing what we have called here farmers' double disconnection, African farmers' double disconnection from markets, from input markets and from output markets. Basically, when you look at the way structural adjustment programs and all those stabilization programs of the 1980s and 90s have done, they have dismantled, basically, they succeeded very well in dismantling all those parastatal and state intervention-based institutions and services that were linking farmers to input markets and to commodity markets. That was done on the basis of the assumption that once the states get out of the way, private sector will fill in. And I used to use this analogy by saying, okay, what happened was a bit like saying, okay, the house in which we were in terms of agricultural development was not a good house. We wanted to build a more performing house, to move in a more performing house. But instead of constructing first that more performing house, we demolished the old non-performing house, dismantling all those support services to farmers, to find ourselves outside without a new house, under the sun, the rain, and everything. Farmers were left out in the vagaries, not linked through credit, through inputs of supply services, and so on and so forth. How could we imagine farmers making the miracle of provoking a big green revolution? That was difficult. And as I said, okay, the global markets, just as the regional markets are growing very fast, but by failing to respond to them, what we are witnessing is basically this phenomenon of foreign direct investment. Instead of Africa producing to be a net exporter, Africa's land is being used just like mineral, in the case of minerals, to mine that resource to provide for resources and products elsewhere. This is a big challenge. Next one, the challenge of the fragmentation of the market. Because basically, when we are talking about the regional market, one has to picture how this market looks like now. It's very fragmented within country borderlines, at best along regional economic community lines, but you don't have that big picture. For African business communities, it's a serious problem. Even those who invest very much in the mobile phone business today put billions and billions into that. If they want to go into agriculture, they don't perceive a sizable market where they can make profit. Because some of those areas, particularly agro-industry, agribusiness, would require scale to make efficient business. Small is beautiful, but for some operations, not along the whole value chain of food and agricultural value chain. So that fragmentation right now is playing against African farmers, because the tendency is to keep countries close to each other, putting barriers to trade among African countries, sometimes within the same regional economic communities, let alone among regional economic communities, while at the same time opening doors to trade from outside of Africa. There is a preferential treatment of trade, food and agricultural trade from outside of Africa today at the level of African countries, rather than preferential treatment among African countries. We see that very often whenever there is a problem and we have to close doors to the neighbor and so on and so forth. At the same time, you'll find those doors are very, very open to the outside. So those two levels, the fragmentation of the market and the disconnection of the farmers from both input and output markets, are two key challenges that we think should be taken into account in looking at the way forward. Okay. Within this context, we do have a very, very conducive and good framework at the regional level. We have the CADEP. We all know it's articulated around 4 pillars. We know that it targets a 6% annual growth rate in agriculture. We know that African heads of state committed to allocating 10% of budget, which is very low for some countries. It can be discussed. But one question that we have been always raising, how do we link those pillars together so that they talk to each other? For example, how do we make sure that investment in land and water, investment in infrastructure, in supply chains, and research and development talk to each other? CADEP has made, CADEP is making progress in terms of implementation on different initiatives along those 4 pillars. But yet, the question is, again, how do we make them talk to each other in a purposive and strategic manner? Next one. That is where we raise this question, how to come up with the $250 billion investment envelope for CADEP. It's been said, okay, it's about $13 billion a year average, public and private sector altogether. And then we tend to always hear this complaint and concern about where the resources would come. It's a puzzle for a region, a continent that is able to put a $30 billion bill to import food and agricultural commodities from the rest of the world per year, to say that we cannot find $13 billion a year to invest in our agriculture is a serious problem. It simply proves that something is going wrong. And the thing going wrong is certainly about policies and institutions which should create incentives for converting this import bill into an investment endowment for agriculture. And that's how, in collaboration with the African Union Commission, FAO, NEPAD, we came up at this Abuja Food Security Summit with the notion of strategic food and agricultural commodities. What is in this $50 billion import bill that Africa can do, has comparative advantage to do, but is not doing because of some problem? We gave some criteria for identifying such commodities and came up at the summit, with 9 commodities. When you look at the composition of the 9 commodities, they cover basically a great deal of what it takes for Africa's food security, but also for farmers' income. And next one. For those commodities, way forward, what we have proposed is simply to turn those commodities to start building the common African agricultural market around those commodities. This project has been on the table of the African Union for maybe 20 years now, building that market. But how do we go practically, operationally about it? Remember that the European common market started by 2 commodities. We cannot do everything at the same time. We say, if we were to agree among African countries to cooperate around those selected commodities and start building cooperation and a common market, you look at the 4 different areas that we have proposed. You link the CADEP 4 pillars around the clear objectives of placing Africa in a major playing position for those commodities, not only within the region, but globally. Linking research and development through centers of excellence, cooperating for research and development around those commodities. Preferential areas of investment in what would look like the American different commodity belts, maize belt, rice belt, and name it, and so on and so forth. You put all the policy conditions, the policy incentives around those belts to attract private investment, African private investment, and even foreign direct investment in joint venture with African investment. And basically, you turn those commodities in commodities without borders. We think that this might be one way of coming around the problem. Next one. Along those lines, I have detailed a bit some of the kind of interventions that would be needed, maybe at the research and development level. They're here. I'm not going to go into all the details there, taking into account challenges like climate change, adaptation, and post-harvest technologies that have been mentioned, given all the losses that we are incurring right now, rural energy, renewable energies, and so on and so forth, and basically market information and communication. Same thing for the area of infrastructure. NEPAD has a very nice program of corridors, infrastructure corridors. Link them to the clear objective of placing this continent in a global major playing position for those strategic commodities. And then you don't throw roads randomly. You know why they should be linking point A to point B. And public-private partnerships are very useful and very important there. Let's move to the next one. In agribusiness and agro-processing development, we propose also a few areas of interventions, action points towards the future. Let's move to the next because I've expanded my 3 times 1 minute left, basically. In terms of access to financing, there are some areas also where we can think. But again, one tends to overhear always when we are talking about financing agriculture in Africa, microcredit. Microcredit is very good, but microcredit is for solving micro problems, for micro operations. It's not for long-term investment for capital formation. I have no recollection of a single case in the world where you built capital, you form capital seriously, significantly around microcredit. So let's put the scale of credit and financing commensurate with the scale of the problem we are solving and not overemphasize things that will not deliver on agricultural development and revolution in Africa. Finally, my last slide here is to say, okay, all this involves basically challenges, capacity challenges. Challenges to think through forward, medium term, long term, and craft policies, strategies, and programs along those lines, instead of putting bricks that will not add together in a harmonious house. And in doing that, thinking simultaneously at intervention and actions on 4 points, what I call my TIIPs: technology, of course, infrastructure, certainly, institutions, and I think that was emphasized this morning in speeches, and policies. If we articulate and cooperate around those issues, around basic strategic commodities, this continent can realize a revolution, agricultural revolution, in maximum 1 decade. I thank you very much.